You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. I am your host, Ray Gerard. With me in studio today, your co-host, Mr. Bob Hennekeys. Bob?
Thank you, Ray. It's good to be with you. Looking forward to today.
So this is St. Paul's Letters to America, where we talk about, well, hey, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here to write a letter to America? Would there be anything he'd want to tell us? Would he have nothing to say? And perhaps he would look across the landscape here in America today and say, hey, we're doing everything just fine. There's nothing he would change. There's nothing he would have to tell us. Well, perhaps not. Perhaps not. So, if in fact he would write a letter to America and have something to tell us, what would he tell us? Well, here on this program, we're going to tell you. We're going to give you just such a letter. And today that letter is this. For those who live according to the flesh are concerned with the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit with the things of the Spirit. The concern of the flesh is death, but the concern of the Spirit is life and peace. For the concern of the flesh is hostility toward God. It does not submit to the law of God, nor can it. But those who are in the flesh, and those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh. On the contrary, you are in the Spirit, if only the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, why would we think, or would St. Paul want to, why would we think that's important? Why would we think St. Paul would write that to us today? Why would he want to tell us that today? Well, let's talk about why I hope to die at 75. That's right. This program today, we're going to use the title, Welcoming Death. Hello, death. Gentle death, lovely death, beautiful death. Yes, why we should all, like Ezekiel Emanuel, hope to die at 75. 6 years ago, September 2014, Mr. Ezekiel Emanuel wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine called Why I Hope to Die at 75. And who is Ezekiel Emanuel? Do you know who he is? Do you not? Well, he's the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff for President Obama. I think the first part of Mr. Obama's term as president.
He went on to be mayor of Chicago,
and then went on to be mayor. Then went on to be mayor of Chicago. Yes, but Mr. Ezekiel Emanuel isn't simply the brother of somebody in the public limelight. Mr. Ezekiel Emanuel is in the public limelight to some degree himself. He was, in fact, one of the principal architects of Obamacare. He also serves on the advisory committee for Mr. Joseph Biden, who is the Democratic nominee, likely to be the Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States. This advisory committee is called the Public Health Advisory Committee. So what is that committee? What do they deal with? What do they talk about? Well, things like universal health care, things like what should in fact be the health care policy of this country. 300 million people need to be served properly by a health care policy, and he is one of the people on Mr. Biden's committee to consider such questions. Now, back in 2014, when he wrote this article, The Atlantic published, along with the article, a short little bio of Mr. Emanuel. And he's referenced as the vice provost of the University of Pennsylvania, so a high-ranking position at the University of Pennsylvania, concerned with guiding the curriculum and the educational structure and the educational values for one of the major universities of this country. And he's also listed as a bioethicist. Of course, why wouldn't he be listed as a bioethicist? He's been serving in these national roles at the height of national government and national political campaigns on issues of medical policy, health policies, bioethics. So important person in his own right.
Yeah, Penn is a pretty good university. I was sent there for a couple weeks by one of my companies to understand business, brilliant business school, and understand business and business ethics and things that we do, and was always very impressed with Penn itself. But there's a lot of really sharp students going there. He must have a lot to say to these very, very talented young men and young ladies. If he's you said the provost?
The vice provost.
Vice provost. So pretty important job.
Pretty important job. I don't know, maybe today he is the provost. I don't know. But anyway, back in 2014, he was the vice provost. Anyways, important job. Influential person both at the university and nationally on questions like the ones we're talking about, dealing with major issues concerning all of us, healthcare policy. All right, so if he, has this kind of role, it might be interesting to know, well, hey, what are some of his views on bioethical issues? Well, let's take one of them, shall we? How about death? Death. That's a nice. So, who doesn't want to talk about death? Well, anyways, his article is called "Why I Hope to Die at 75," and he says that's how long I want to live, 75 years. He says this drives his daughters crazy, but nevertheless, he also says, "I am sure of my position." He said, doubtless death is a loss. It deprives us of experiences. So that is what life is. It's basically just an accumulation of very experiences that we have here on earth. He says he's long been opposed, even since the 1980s, publicly opposed to legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide. So he's not into, it would seem, just helping people to kill themselves. He's not in favor of that. So if he wants to die at 75 and he's not into euthanasia, how does that work? Well, we'll explain to that. We'll get to that. But let's continue a little bit more with this idea of, what he has to say about, why 75? What life is like before 75, what life is like after 75. Why 75? Well, he says... He says 75 is a pretty good age to stop. And why? What are the reasons? He says, let's begin with demography. Demography. Statistics. Data. I don't know about you, but it seems a little cold, a little impersonal, but no, that's where he starts. Statistics. Okay? He says, for example, that, when you get older, things become harder. Like, for example, if you want to walk a quarter of a mile, if you want to climb 10 stairs, if you want to stand or sit for 2 hours and either bend or kneel without using special equipment, all of these things become harder when you get older. And when you're 75, apparently, a good deal harder. He talks about his own father, who, he's over 75 and he can swim, he can read the newspaper, he can needle his kids on the phone. He can still live with his mother in their own house. And he says, his father says that he is happy. However, he also talks about his father. He says he's sluggish. And he doesn't think anyone would say he's living a vibrant life. He talks about the growing, prevalence of things like Alzheimer's in our population today. People are living longer. He talks about the fact that the life expectancy in the U.S., I think in the turn of the century, it was, somewhere around 50. By 1930, it had grown to about, 60, and then by the 1960s, I think it was up to 70, and then it. Now I think it's 75 or over 75. So our life expectancy is growing as we're living longer. Apparently dementia is becoming more prevalent as well. And Mr. Emmanuel talks about a tsunami of dementia that is coming our way. He talks about how our mental functioning deteriorates. Our mental processing speed is not the same. We cannot focus and stay with a project as well as we could. We lose our creativity. He talks about a prominent health economist of his who's about to turn 80, and he's incredibly productive, but he's an exception to the rule. Einstein apparently famously said, a person who has not made his great contribution to science before the age of 30 will never do so. And I guess often enough, that probably is, if you're going to make a great contribution to science, I guess by the time of age 30, that's probably true. Emmanuel starts looking at a lot of statistics and various studies that have been done on the subject, and he shows that, and these studies show that creativity rises rapidly as a career commences. It peaks about 20 years into their career at about age 40 or 45, and then after that it starts to go down. And he says that once you get past 75, those numbers are pretty low, and there is no getting around the data. It's the data. It's the numbers. That's what counts.
Yeah, Ray, if I think about all of this, and there's a couple things that I would agree with Mr. Emmanuel quite freely.
Sure.
One, our physical capability, right, is probably peaks when we're in our late teens to early 20s, right? That's when you are the biggest, you're still growing, you've got everything together. And so the peak athletes, young ladies even more so, they hit their stride, and the best performers in gymnastics are 16 years old. In track, quite often it's 20 years old, and people struggle after that a little bit. And so physically, I think that's probably about the peak. And I don't think mentally it's too far behind that, but I do believe that our experiences add to that. So for myself, my brain was firing on all cylinders as fast as it could in my early 20s, and probably the electrons and the neurons were flying around as quickly as they could. But the lack of experiences that I had at that point, the great number of experiences, added to my ability to solve problems and to think things through and to gain. So I would guess his number of 45 makes sense to me. That's when I felt I was absolutely at my peak. The brain was still firing pretty well, pretty substantially, close to when it was at its peak. And then another 25 years of life experiences outside of college and outside of the world sort of went together and garnered and probably hit it. All of that being true, right?
Yeah.
There's no doubt there is a peak and a decline, and you can grab data and say that.
Yeah.
Why would we drop off at some level when we're not at our peak? That says there's nothing but productivity that matters. Anything outside of the realm of being at our best and being productive, life is not worth living. That's got to be his argument, isn't it?
Life is not worth it. It's interesting. Bishop Sheen, of course, used to have that famous program, Life is Worth Living.
Yeah.
And I guess we should add a corollary to that if we agree with the bioethical opinions expressed in this article from 2014 by saying, what, life is worth living until you're 75.
I have to take exception as we're talking, and it's a real simple thing. About 6 or 7 years ago, I gave up my career and moved in with my father, who at the time was 91, to take care of him. So I was with a gentleman, very loving, wonderful gentleman, 91 years old, and he was struggling to walk up 10 steps. And he was struggling to bend over and do things all correct, as has been prescribed. And he needed help. He needed somebody to drive him. He needed somebody to do all of those things. But to somehow say that his life was not worth living has got to be nuts. At 91, he was the most wonderful man in terms of asking questions and being with him and talking about his experiences and the wealth of knowledge that he still brought, and the thought process of how to make decisions were all unbelievably substantial at 91. And a very sharp guy. Now, his mother lived to be 102, and he comes from, and therefore I come from, a group that lives long and does well and has their mind. And he eventually got dementia. He eventually did. But to somehow say that we should be cheated out of those experiences, that I sat with him and just listened lovingly to hear the experience, the knowledge, the capability that he had at 91 years old, to lose that would be horrible. It'd be just absolutely horrible. And then the thought of losing at 75 and saying we don't have things to do spiritually. I'm blown away by this whole thing.
Well, as he started this article, his daughters would disagree vehemently with him on this, and are hoping that he changes his viewpoint on this. But why are we bringing this up? Why are we even having this discussion? I mean, obviously, you can have a very different opinion, Bob, than Mr. Emmanuel. And you can see for your father, who was 91, all of this value that he still, had. Every human life is precious. And so you can disagree with him. So he's got his opinion, you got yours. Why does it matter? What does it matter? Does it have larger ramifications for our society today? And would St. Paul see a problem with it? And oh, yes. And we're going to get to this. But it has very large ramifications and implications for what is going on all around us in the world today. And we can look at this whole coronavirus thing and see this play out. There are real connections between this type of thinking and what's happening with the response to coronavirus. How is that? What are those connections? Well, let's continue this out a little further, and you shall see. You shall see, he says. Let's see if we can make that happen. Anyways, this very debate that you're engaging in, Bob, Mr. Emmanuel does himself in this article. And he asks, isn't there more to life than being physically fit and continuing to add to one's creative legacy? So there it is, flat on the table. Isn't there more to life? I mean, why shouldn't you live past 75? Well, he talks about a colleague of his, a college professor, who was at that age and who wasn't publishing, wasn't contributing, wasn't, being still so creative anymore. However, his friend, this professor that he knew, in this professor's mind, was bringing value to the table because he was mentoring other students. Wasn't publishing, wasn't coming up with new ideas, but he was mentoring other students. On a one-to-one level, he was helping a single individual person one at a time. Does that have value? Is that worth continuing to live for? Well, Mr. Emmanuel says that mentoring is, and I'm using his words now, all of these things I'm saying are, the direct quotes from this article. And he says, quote, mentoring is hugely important, but it also illumines a key issue with aging: the constricting of our ambitions and expectations. He's arguing with himself. He says, geez, isn't there more to life than just being physically fit and being able to publish articles? Isn't there more to it than that? And he goes into this discussion about this friend of his, and so with helping other students. And so you're thinking to yourself, well, he's going to say yes. He's leading you as the reader of this article to a position where you think he's going to say yes. And who wouldn't say yes? Isn't there more to do? Maybe because if all there is producing articles and being physically fit, are we really much different than robots or, just some kind of animal or mechanical tool? I mean, isn't there more to us? Doesn't it lead to a bigger question? Isn't there more to us than just doing things? So he seems to want to say yes, but he ends by saying no. He says, all we're doing is constricting our ambitions. And so, our ambitions should not be restricted. And if they are getting restricted because we can't do as much, well, then guess what? Life doesn't have so much value anymore. So he ends back where he started. But he's still not satisfied with himself because he raises the question again, just one paragraph later in this article. And he talks about his response. He says, maybe this is too dismissive. There is more to life than youthful passions focused on career and creating. There is posterity, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Okay, so now we're back to life has more value again. So you're thinking, okay, well, maybe this time he'll admit, there is more to life than just these simple mechanical functions and so forth. But don't hope too long, because the very next thing he says is, but, again, another but, here too, living as long as possible has drawbacks. And often we won't admit these to ourselves. What does he talk about now? What's he going to point to now? Well, he says, unless there has been terrible abuse, no child wants his or her parents to die. Now, I guess just on the surface, you think, well, okay, that's reasonable. But think about it. Think what he just said. Unless there has been terrible abuse, no child wants his or her parents to die. In other words, if there has been abuse, you do want them to die. My father was abusive in a way, not as we normally speak of that term nowadays when you talk about parental abuse. It wasn't sexual. It was emotional, it was mental, and it was physical to some degree. He was a severe alcoholic. He created a great deal of turmoil, anger, hostility, just constant 24/7 warfare in the house. Now, the warfare was all one-sided because it was always him against everybody else. And it was horrible, and it went on for years. My mother was the one who suffered the most directly from it. But I didn't want him to die. He did die back in 1985, and I pray for his soul every day. I don't harbor hate towards him, but under Mr. Emmanuel's thinking and way of thinking, if you did want your parent to die, well, that would be understandable. That would be okay. And I think St. Paul and all of the saints would simply say, no, that's completely backwards. But anyways, let's continue. All right, so putting that aside, because he's not talking about that particular case, okay? He's talking about parents who don't commit abuse, okay? I mean, shouldn't they live past 75? Parents who don't commit abuse, shouldn't they be entitled to continued life experiences with children and grandchildren? Well, no. And here's why he thinks not. He says parents also cast a big shadow for most children, whether estranged, disengaged, or deeply loving. They set expectations, render judgments, impose their opinions, interfere, and are generally a looming presence for even adult children. This can be wonderful. It can be annoying. It can be destructive. But it is inescapable. Inescapable, as long as the parent is alive. He says, while children can never fully escape this weight, even after a parent dies, he says after a parent dies, there is much less pressure. You can't escape it even after, but afterwards, at least, there is much less pressure to conform to parental expectations. Wow. I mean, talk about, just a really pessimistic, dark view. So, Bob, when your father, between the ages of 75 and 91, he's just a burden, just a weight on you with all of these expectations and interference. And, boy, I'm sure you just wanted him to die.
Ray, that is so different than my story, right, with my father. I couldn't wait wherever I was in the world. I could not wait to be back with him, to sit and talk to him and to listen to his experiences. And it's so completely opposite of that. There was no intrepidation. There was no overbearing. It was all completely a advisory role and a loving role. I think back and a wonderful book that I read by Richard Rohr, Falling Upward. And Mr. Rohr, a brilliant guy, explains, and it makes sense to me because it's very much who I am and what I've done. He explains that in the first half of your life, you tend to be all about getting enough stuff around you that you're comfortable. So always looking for a new job with more pay and more responsibility so you can build enough stuff where you feel comfortable. You feel like you can live out your life. You feel like you have a shell, a house around you, a car, all the things that you need to live your life and protect the ones you love. And when that's sort of done in the second half of life, Mr. Rohr makes a point that you actually begin to think much deeper. And you begin to say, what is there to life besides building this shell? And the inevitable answer for me was God and others and taking care of others and being with them. And that's what I saw my father doing. And that's what I try to do is I ran away from protecting this world just for me. And I wasn't an egomaniac by any stretch of the imagination, but I did focus towards building my life for my wife and children and try to get enough that I had a comfort. And as it began to come true, I began to widen and say, what should I be doing that's much more worthwhile? And while I had been in love with God all of my life, I then came up with the answer that it was truly service to God that was the answer, right? I should put all these other things aside and do everything in my heart and soul to serve my Savior and my God. And that's Richard Rohr writes the book and says it way more eloquently than I could. And he says it very early and often. But what a wonderful thing that is. And I see that in my father. And I don't see any death at 75 as being worthwhile. That can be when philosophically we are hitting our stride. We may have lost something physically and mentally, but we are driven to support and help others. And I see a lot of that for the older generation. They can't wait to take care of other people, grandchildren, children, others in their field of business or field of endeavor, right? Wonderful things.
So I've got an answer for Mr. Emanuel. You know, he says, he's arguing with himself. He's having this internal debate, going back and forth. Isn't there more to life, than just these, mechanical things? I got an answer. I don't know why this answer should be so hard. I don't know why he couldn't write this as his answer. And it's what you were talking about, Bob. It's exactly what you were talking about. How about love? How about love? Isn't there more to life than these things that he's talking about, this creativity, this ability to publish, et cetera, the ability to walk a quarter mile and do physical things? Isn't there more to it? Yeah. How about love? Now, when you're caring like you did, Bob, for a parent who's older and can't, do some things for himself anymore, what are you doing? You're giving back. Love is great when it's a circle, isn't it? It's a nice, beautiful circle. Your parents give you love, hopefully, when you're a child, and then you have a chance to give it back. And what is that reflective of? Well, God gives us love. God gave us love by giving us life. God gives us love by giving us freedom. God gives us love through the cross. God gives us love in so many ways. And Bob, when you said your decision was, to devote your life to God, and you're doing that through your participation in the diaconate program, and we're very lucky that you're in that program. Very lucky you're on this program joining us. But what are you doing? You're giving back to God. It's a nice, beautiful circle. There's a poetry to it. There's a harmony to it. There's a beauty and a truth and a goodness to it. It's love. Love is always the answer to everything. And it's something that you will find nowhere in this article. Now. Having said all of that, why is this important? Let me ask this. Is this important? Why bring up an article that's 6 years old? Is this important? Yes. Why? Well, first of all, it's 6 years old. Well, let's say why. Why should it not be important? First of all, it's 6 years old. Second of all, it's just one guy. It's just one guy. His own daughters and family doesn't agree with him or don't agree with him. So Okay, so why make such a big deal about it? Here's the thing. It's not just one guy. It's not. It's a lot of people. A lot of people. And it's a lot of people in power. It's a lot of people who are running government, running segments of the government, running parts of our lives. Now, why would I say that? Because if you asked all these people, do you want to die? Do you agree that everybody should be dead at 75? Well, I mean, his advisor to Senator Biden, former Vice President Biden, you think the former Vice President Biden would say, yeah? I mean, Mr. Biden's over 75. I don't think he'd say yes. So it's just the thing of one guy. A lot of other people wouldn't agree with him. But maybe they, but on some level, unconscious, maybe not so unconscious, don't they agree with him? Well, yeah, they do. And why do I say that? We can see it all around us. The response to this coronavirus pandemic has involved several things. And they correlate to the things you find in this article. We promised you we'd draw this connection. Here we go. First, Mr. Emanuel says that life is a series of experiences. What is life? It's just this combination year after year of being able to do different things, and that's when someone writes the story of your life after it's all over, it's going to be just a listing of experiences. That is, in fact, life. Okay? What do we find with the response to the coronavirus? Separation. We're supposed to be separated from other people. Well, I got a question for you. What value would there be to experiences if you were the only person on the planet? If there was just simply one human being on the entire earth and you were he or she, do you think you'd have much value to your experiences?
None whatsoever.
No,
It wouldn't make any dang difference, right?
It wouldn't make a difference.
Yeah.
So anyways, I mean, your experiences, what experiences are you going to have? I mean, experiences with family? You wouldn't have them. I mean, separation taken to its logical conclusion. I mean, obviously they're saying, well, shelter in the home, you're still going to be with family. I get that. But at its core, the principle behind the coronavirus response is separating you from other people. Okay, so your experiences are not going to have anywhere near the value that they would have otherwise. Okay, that's number one. Number two, he talks about the value of life, including contributions to society, contributions to the world, contributions to our global community, the world at large. Whether that's publishing scholastic works or doing whatever it is you do to contribute to the good of all. Whether it's, you're working in a meat packing plant and you help provide food on the table so other people can eat and live. Whether you're a doctor and you save lives, whatever your contribution to society is, you're doing it, that's great. Okay, guess what the response to the coronavirus involves? 30 million people with no work. You can't work. Close down all business. Now you cannot contribute to society. Is this too far-fetched? There's lots of people that are still working, but we're talking about the principle here, the idea behind the response that the government has concocted. What's the idea here? What's the effect here? When the church has tried to discern over the millennia whether or not something is connected to God, whether it's a supposed miracle, whether there's a revelation of some sort to a saint, what do they look at? They look at what are the results, what comes of it, what are the fruits of the event. If it comes from God, the fruits will be good. If it doesn't, they'll be bad. We're talking about the fruits here of this coronavirus response, this entire worldly shelter in place, stay at home, government lockdown kind of mentality. What are the fruits of that? The fruits of that is people out of work, businesses going under, people not being able to contribute. All right? Is that it? There's a third element here. He talks, Mr. Emanuel also talks about creativity. That creativity is important. It gives flavor. It gives value to life, does it not? That's the opportunity where we have to be who we are, to show who we are, to give some kind of fulfillment to each of us as a person. Creativity, it's important. He talks about that a lot. Okay, now what do we got? No freedom. You can't go outside. If you go outside, as the mayor of Chicago says, we're watching you. If you want to invite, people over to your house, you just want to invite people over to your house. Well, are you inviting more than 10 people? We're going to, as the mayor of Chicago said, we're going to monitor social media, and if you're inviting more than 10 people, we're coming after you. You are being watched. You are being watched. And we find similar things in New York and other places. You can't go to the parks are closed. You can't do this. You can't do that. No freedom. What is creativity if it's not an expression of your God-given freedom, your ability to be who you are, who you want to be? So on this level, again, people can say, well, you still have freedom. You can still do. Yeah, I know, but we're talking about the principle of the thing. What is the message that is being sent? And more than that, what are the ideas, the philosophical ideas, the philosophical base, the outlook on life that is shared by the people that are creating these policies? We've often said that we look at the writings of St. Paul to look at the ideas, and then we're going to examine those ideas and see whether or not they match up with other things that we find to be true. Because if what Paul writes is consistent with other things we think are true, or that we trust, then there's a chance that what Paul writes is also true and trustworthy. Well, likewise, you flip it around. If something is producing bad results, if something seems like it's off kilter, if the results are off kilter, then chances are the ideas that produced those actions are also off kilter. And that's what we're saying here, that these policies that lead to separation, no employment, no freedom, that's what's involved with these policies. And they correlate to a worldview that says your life is it's not really about love. It's just simply about the experiences that you can enjoy. It's just simply about what you can contribute in a statistical way to society. It's about, it's about not having creativity. I mean, these things correlate. It's amazing. Your view of life also will affect your view of death. And if your view of death is, well, you might as well do it at 75 because why? Because life isn't that important. Whereas if you think the opposite, if you think life is important, and why? Isn't life more important than these, than just simple experiences and contributions and creativity? Yeah. If your answer to that question is yes, there is more to life than that. If you are willing to go to that place where Mr. Emanuel is not willing to go, if one asks the question, isn't there more to life than simply these mechanical, utilitarian kind of experiential things? These statistical things. We're going to measure your creativity with statistics. They peak at age 45 and it starts to decline. We measure individual people with statistics. Well, anyways, if you're willing to go past that, and you're willing to answer yes to the question that Mr. Emanuel was not willing to answer yes to, if you're willing to say, yeah, there is more to life than just simply these things, then you'll end up with, death is not something that we should simply say yes to. That no, death is something we should say no to, because there is more value to life. There is the love of a grandparent, the love that grandparent's able to offer, the love that grandparent is able to offer in gratitude for being taken care of. They may be bedridden, they may not be able to do much, but won't they be grateful for what people are doing for them? And the people that are doing things for them, won't they feel that gratitude? I mean, there is love that is being exchanged, and that's valuable.
Yeah, I think when you think this through, it doesn't take very long to get to the point that Mr. Emmanuel has completely forgotten about anyone that doesn't have this ability to move the planet forward. The difference is that God loves every one of us, regardless of our ability or our challenges or anything else. For those that don't have the same mental capacity, do you do away with them? No, you don't, because God loves them with all his heart, and he wants them to be here and to be with us. And we take care of others. We take care of the marginalized. We take care of those that are struggling. And that's what God wants us to do. When Jesus was alive, he didn't go spend time with the great thinkers of the time. In fact, he made fun of them. He challenged them, and he spent time with the sinners and the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the carpenters that were struggling. And he took care of those that weren't loved by others. And that is what God is asking us to do. It is not to produce in a way of performing money or task. It is love, and to produce that for other people and to take care of one another and watch over one another. And that's what God is and will continue to ask for the rest of time of us, to watch over those that we can and to help. And that's what he desires us to do.
If we think that the answer is love, then that reverses, that turns upside down another calculation that Mr. Emmanuel makes. He talks about people who are declining and how you want to be remembered. He's like, what do you leave behind you except memories and the people that you love of who you are? And how do you want them to remember you? Do you want, and he says this, I'm not paraphrasing or extrapolating. This is actually what he says. I mean, I am paraphrasing, but this is actually what he says. Do you want them to remember you as vibrant and, active and so on and so forth? Do you want them to remember you at your best? Or do you want them to remember you as frail, doddering, not able to remember things, not able to feed yourself? How do you want to be remembered? And so the way he answers that question is, obviously, don't give them memories of you as being doddering and old and frail. So die at 75. But the fact of the matter is, of course, that's not what people remember. Even if you do live to the point where you're unable to care for yourself, that's not what people remember. People remember you, when you were younger. But that's beside the point. The real point is this. That outlook measures your value based on the memories people have of you. It's concerned with the self. Whereas if it's about love, then what you really can leave behind you, and you can leave nothing else behind you. He can talk about contributions. He can talk about creativity. He can talk about having great scientific discoveries before age 30 or, publishing until you're 45 and then having those things drop off. And it's those contributions to society at large that matter. And that's what you can leave behind you, or memories of you that live in other people. But that's the value of your life. But the fact of the matter is, the only thing you can leave behind you is love. The only thing that can still live after you no longer have earthly life is love. And love can live on in the hearts of other people, the people with whom you came in contact, your loved ones. So now, if they continue to live on this earth with love that you helped create, that you exchanged, that you helped grow, foster, in some way add to, then it's it's a part of them that's growing. It's as if you lived your life in a loving way so that that love could live on in other people. It's as if you were giving to other people. You're helping to create a better life for other people, because that life that those other people may have may continue with some love in their heart. It's about the other person. Memories of you, that's about you. The focus there is about you. How do they remember you? You want them to remember you well. No. What you can really hope for, the best thing you can aspire for, is to help them live well. And how can you? That's the only thing you can leave behind you in this world. The only thing you can leave behind you in this world is love. You can help people to live better after you're gone if you've left them with love.
If you think about St. Paul, who this program is about, and you think about Jesus, neither of those cases did they come up with a single theory that a scientist would say is wonderful or amazing. Neither of them came up with any great wealth, died relatively poor. Neither of them came up with anything that is supposed to be important to most people. But what they did leave behind are some beautiful words of love, how to live our life and to take care of others and to watch over others and to love them. And that's what they left behind. And it was that wonderful memory, right, that brought us to this place. It was that memory of love that causes us to actually change our lives into something that's not about money and not about possessions and not about theories and not about buildings, but about how we take care of others.
Did you ever see the movie A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so you've got, some big names, right? Big stars, Burl Ives, Elizabeth Taylor, Paul Newman, big stars. Anyways, so I just, as you're talking, Bob, I just remember that scene in the basement with Burl Ives and Paul Newman. So Paul is playing the son of Burl Ives. And it's a dysfunctional family. So Burl Ives has made a lot of money. He's a rich, plantation type owner in the South. And Paul Newman is the son with the silver spoon who's never amounted to anything on his own. He was a college football, star, and it was good while the glory lasted. But then after he got hurt, can't play anymore. He tried to play professional football for a while, that fell off, and now he's a drunk, and he's struggling with his life and so forth. And he and his father have never gotten along. They have never had a good relationship. And they're in the basement. And Burl Ives is facing death. He's facing cancer. And Paul Newman tells him that the report from the doctor was bad. The doctors lied to him. Burl Ives thought he was going to live. But now he's been told, no, you're dying. He's facing death. And Burl Ives starts ranting and raving about his own father. His own father was a hobo and never left him a thing. I think he left him like a suitcase and a straw hat, and that's about it. Never left him a thing in the world. And Burl Ives is thinking that he has left his son so much. There's so much property, so much money, so much wealth, so many material things. And that's exactly what Paul Newman objects to. He says, things, Papa, things. You've left me things. I don't want things. I wanted you to love me. I wanted at some point in your life to say you loved me. And I think Burl Ives says, yes, but I have. And he's like, no, you never have. And he asked Burl Ives about his father, the hobo. He said, so that's all he left you, was this hat and a suitcase. And he says, yeah, that's it, that's all. He said, well, and then he gets Burl Ives to talk about his old man. And Burl Ives talks about how, he took me everywhere. He took me with him. And he starts to reminisce about his old man, and a smile comes on his face and this and that. And Paul Newman asks him, so he cared about you? He goes, yeah, he did care about me. And Paul Newman says, so you still say the only thing he left you was this hat and a suitcase? He goes, no, you're right. he left me love. And that's what Paul Newman wanted his Father to leave him. It was a gripping, grueling, touching moment. And it's exactly about what we're talking about here. The only thing that you can really leave behind you that can live on is love. So this is not a new concept. People who made this movie, people who wrote the book, Cat on a Hot Tin, it was their concept. It's a truth. It's an eternal truth. It's a truth that lasts. St. Paul, and again, as always on this program, there are a lot of things we wanted to touch on that we haven't been able to touch on. I'm going to do it anyway. Quickly, there's this whole coronavirus response. It's about death and suicide. We're killing ourselves. We're inflicting harm on ourselves. There's something depressed about that. There's a negative outlook. When you go through this article by Mr. Emanuel, you find so much negativity. We touched on it loosely, where he talks about parents, even if they're engaged, being a weight and a burden on their children, and it's inescapable. And so there's so much negativity here. It's a dark, depressed, self-destructive. There's an outlook. It's a desire for self-destructiveness, and that's apparently it seems like that's what's behind these governmental orders. You can't go to church. Oh, we haven't even talked about that. Emmanuel talks about, his socially acceptable, comfortable agnosticism and atheism. That's what this all gets down to. You get away from God and you're left with being depressed and negative, and ultimately, it really, you want to inflict harm on yourself, and ultimately you carry that to its conclusion, and it's about death. It's about wanting death. It's about suicide. That's what he's talking about. I want to be dead at 75. It has tremendous social policy implications because he's talking about not giving medical treatments to people after a certain age, because, hey, life's not worth it. Okay, so we just crammed, another hour's worth of discussion into the last 60 seconds. So the bottom line, there's a lot at play here. But what does St. Paul talk about? I'd love to maybe we should talk about this for another hour. But anyways, maybe we should. What does Paul talk about? Paul talks about that if you have the Spirit in you, you have life and peace. He talks about the people who, don't have it, having a hostility towards God. They can't please God. They can't accept God. And Mr. Emanuel, God bless him, and I hope that it's somewhere, deep down inside, he has a belief in God. It's planted there from when we were born, and God willing, he'll acknowledge that, and maybe he does on some level. I don't know. But that's what you get a hostility to God. And that's another parallel with the coronavirus thing, because now we've got no church. They won't let the churches be open. So, Paul says, hope that sees for itself is not hope. For who hopes for what one sees? And that's what Mr. Emanuel does. He's looking at the world at what he sees. He doesn't have hope past 75. Anyway, I'd love to spend more time on this, but that's all we have. So we hope this has been provocative, enjoyable, somewhat entertaining. Bob, I want to thank you for joining us again.
Always my pleasure, Ray. Thank you.
And we hope you join us again. Until the next time, God bless.
Everybody, this is Al Belowski, host of Catholic Mysticism and All Things Catholic. We have such a beautiful, vibrant faith, and I want to introduce you to it. And what we do on the show is we talk about the supernatural. We talk about a prayer life. We talk about the battle that's waged between good and evil. We talk about Satan, and we talk about God and the battle that they have begun for our souls. And we talk about our brothers and sisters, the saints. And we want to get you into this wonderful supernatural aspect of our faith, where we talk about miracles of the Eucharist, where we talk about Our Lady's apparitions at Fatima and Lourdes. And we can let our souls be nourished with this and continue to grow closer to our Lord in holiness. And by our brothers and sisters that have gone before us, the saints, that we tap into their lives and talk about them and the challenges that are so relevant today in our world as it was for them. And we use this to become closer and closer to our Lord, because we are spiritual beings, and He has given us this great gift of His church to nourish us with His sacraments, especially in the Eucharist, and confession and confirmation, and all the beautiful things of our faith that lead us closer and closer to Him. So I hope you'll tune in for Catholic Mysticism, where we will try, you and I, together, to grow closer through the Holy Spirit to our Lord Jesus Christ. God bless.
For listening to a production of WCAT Radio, please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.